Alzheimer's disease is the sixth leading cause of death in our country. In 2019, more than 121,000 Americans died from the neurological disease, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. For several decades, scientists have been puzzled by its origins and debilitating effects. In fact, the first described case was more than 100 years ago, in 1906, by German psychiatrist Alois Alzheimer. For years, he studied a 50-year-old female patient who was suffering from paranoia, confusion, and memory loss, symptoms that we would describe today as dementia. While scientists have grasped a basic understanding of Alzheimer's disease, the most common type of dementia, many believe we've barely scratched the surface.
Alzheimer's disease affects the most complicated organ of the body, the brain. We know a lot about the brain, but there's a lot that we don't know about the brain. We're struggling to learn how the brain functions. Our sensations, our impressions of ourselves, our personalities, our thoughts, our memories, consciousness itself, it's all dependent on the brain. And yet we know very little about the mechanisms of the brain that support these functions.
That's Dr. Robert Vassar, the scientific director of behavioral neurology at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. He's also the director of the university's Alzheimer's Disease Research Center within the Mesalem Center for Cognitive Neurology and Alzheimer's Disease. Vassar believes there have been a lot of failures in clinical trials because scientists were treating at the wrong stage of the disease.
Once symptoms take over, memory symptoms in dementia, there is a substantial amount of damage to the brain, loss of neurons, and brain atrophy, particularly in regions of the brain that are important for memory, like the hippocampus. Now, once the neurons die, they can't come back. And so once they're gone for good. And that's a problem for people that are already diagnosed. They already have damage, ongoing damage to the brain.
But recent technological advances now allow researchers to detect Alzheimer's disease earlier and explore the role of preventative treatment in clinical trial patients.
We've learned slowly that Alzheimer's disease takes many decades to manifest itself. And there's a very long period of time, maybe 10, 20, or 30 years, where the disease is brewing in the brain, and yet there are absolutely no symptoms. And the people having this going on in their brains are on the road to Alzheimer's, but they don't know it. We really didn't understand that because in the past, the only way we could study Alzheimer's disease in people would be at the end of their lives after they passed away, and we were permitted to do a brain autopsy. Now, in the last 10 years or so, we've had some very interesting developments in brain scanning. We are now able to scan the brains of living patients and see these pathologies, the amyloid pathology, occurring over time in living individuals.
The idea that amyloid plaques building up in the brain may be a root cause of Alzheimer's is called the Amyloid Cascade hypothesis. But while this theory has been widely accepted for decades, there's been a great deal of controversy because it's led to a lot of dead ends in large-scale research and clinical trials. Attempts to treat Alzheimer's by going after the plaque buildup just hasn't consistently worked in patients so far.
I can understand the frustration of both, researchers as well as patients and caregivers that there have been all these failures. I'm frustrated too. But I think the point is that we shouldn't now throw the baby out with the bathwater because, these are very well-developed amyloid drugs that really engage the target and remove amyloid from the brain. They do their job very well. We just need to know the appropriate stage of disease at which individuals can be treated. And so my argument would be go well before there are symptoms and before there's damage to the brain.
Dr. Carl Harrop is on the other side of the debate over amyloid and how Alzheimer's research has been tackled over the last few decades. Harrop is a professor of neurobiology and an investigator in the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine.
My estimation is that we know virtually nothing about what causes Alzheimer's disease. So I think we stopped listening to our own data. We kept hoping that we could just ignore all the inconsistencies and keep plowing ahead because the enthusiasm was so high. But if we really look at the data, we have yet to create a mouse that gets anything resembling human Alzheimer's disease, and that's a big problem for us because it cuts the knees out from under any experimental attempt to try and find a treatment, a therapy, a cure. But I think concurrent with that, the rush to publish and the failure really to listen to our own data, I think concurrent with that is we actually distorted the definition of Alzheimer's disease in a way that rendered it close to meaningless.
Harrop argues that another problem in the field is the expanded definition of Alzheimer's. He says the requirement that there must be amyloid deposits in the brain is throwing scientists off. Instead, there needs to be a bigger push to investigate other potential causes for the disease.
I quote an advisor on one of our external advisory boards who simply said quite flatly that if you aren't studying amyloid, you aren't studying Alzheimer's. And not only is that wrong on its face, it is symptomatic of a psychology that requires not only that you promote the use of anti-amyloid therapies, but that you actively suppress investigation into other potential causes of the disease. I think the tide is turning, and we're beginning to look at other factors like inflammation, like vascular problems, and myelination. And we're beginning to see the problem of late-life dementia in a more holistic concept that includes the biology of aging and the incredible heterogeneity and variability from person to person.
Vassar says it's fair to target other theories and try varying treatments based on different stages of the disease. Inflammation, for example, is one aspect of Alzheimer's that shows promise due to the recent discovery of a mutation in a gene called TREM2. This gene is expressed in special immune cells in the brain called microglia.
What occurs is that the microglia surround the amyloid plaques and they react to it, and this reaction is what they're trying to do is remove the amyloid from the brain and get rid of it because they recognize it as a foreign body. But in the process, they're not able to really get rid of it because the amyloid is so indigestible for them. And what they are doing is also producing a lot of inflammatory molecules. And as we know from inflammation throughout the body, inflammation causes pain. It's important for healing, but chronic inflammation can produce damage to tissues. And that is exactly what seems to be happening in the Alzheimer brain.
While the debate over Alzheimer's research rages on, every 65 seconds, one more person is diagnosed with the disease in the U.S. alone. Right now, 6 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's, and this number is set to double over the next 30 years as the population skews older. The progress being made today to examine other causes and focus more on preventative treatment will hopefully save millions to come. To learn more about Alzheimer's disease and research, as well as our guests, Dr. Robert Vassar and Dr. Carl Harrop, head to viewpointsradio.org. Also, check out Dr. Harrop's book, How Not to Study a Disease, The Story of Alzheimer's, available online and in bookstores now. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written by Amira Zaveri, studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
In Asia, they make rice beers. In the Americas, they made corn beers. In Africa, they made sorghum beers.
The rich history of beer. Then,
if they needed test books, if they needed children's books, if they just needed something to read to distract them while they were stuck at home, we were able to provide that service.
How libraries stepped up during the pandemic. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows. And find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.